My name is Lesley Uttley and I'm a Senior Research Fellow at the University of Sheffield in the United Kingdom. My research examines what is commonly regarded as the highest form of evidence in the evidence-based hierarchy, and that is systematic reviews. And in my work, I found that this is an area of research that's receiving attention from most places across the world, but not Africa, also not some parts of Asia and South America. And I'm hoping to raise the profile of this kind of work to African countries. So I'm funded by the UK Medical Research Council to perform this work, but just to state, I am a systematic review advocate. I do believe that they are the best way to synthesize evidence from multiple sources when they're done well. And also the point of this research is not to attack individuals or teams or institutions, but really to encourage reflection on one's own practice to improve systematic reviews in the future. Okay, so systematic reviews are regarded as the gold standard in evidence synthesis and seen as objective, dispassionate processes able to give you a unbiased and comprehensive overview of any topic. But in my work as a systematic reviewer over the last 10 plus years, I've seen increasing examples of poorly conducted systematic reviews submitted to me as a peer reviewer, as a journal editor, as the lead of an evidence review group for NICE. And often these reviews are done by proponents of the intervention. So one of the most common things that we see is undeclared conflicts, and I've seen reviews from whole teams of psychotherapists, physiotherapists, homeopathists reviewing their very own interventions and declaring no conflicts. Not pre-registering your review. So in reviews, you can register after the fact. You could have got to the stage of a meta-analysis in theory, having massaged the right combination of trials in order to reach a significant overall pooled effect, and then obtain a post hoc Prospero registration number that's probably going to help you to get your paper published. Now, we wouldn't accept this kind of thing in primary clinical trials, so why do we accept it for systematic reviews? These are highly cited articles which influence patient care, resource allocation. Only highlighting positive studies or adding a spin to conclusions. And these are not particularly new trends. They've been noted for a while, but we're still not very good at looking who is doing this review, what's the motive for it. And the reason this is important is because a bad systematic review is much more harmful and misleading than just an editorial or a literature review, because it claims to have this level of scientific integrity which is often absent. So when I was preparing the application for this work, I realised that this conversation was being had in many different journals, some teams doing some really good work, but all published in different specialities, different clinical areas, different teams. They weren't citing each other, so it was clear that this conversation was not being joined up, and there was a lot of very similar work, often very heterogeneous work coming out as well. So in parallel, we've also got methodological guidelines which publish and develop open source guidance for people doing systematic reviews and for people appraising them. So PRISMA reporting guidelines, ScHARR for appraising systematic review methodological conduct, the Cochrane Handbook, which is methodological guidance for systematic reviews. And over the years, there's been multiple versions, different extensions coming out and different iterations. Whilst this is all freely available, the conduct of reviews that are being published doesn't often match with the developments in these guidelines. So I decided to try to join up this very sporadic conversation that was happening across biomedical literature and do a living systematic review of the problems with systematic review, to bring together all these different studies highlighting problems in published systematic reviews. And the reason why to do a living review as opposed to a normal systematic review is when a topic is emerging or there's a vast amount of literature coming out and you want to kind of capture how the literature is looking over a period of time as opposed to just one static time point, then a living review is an option. So I have a dedicated website which documents the outputs of this review, which is globally accessible, and I've also published a complementary journal paper in the Journal of Clinical Epidemiology. In order to embrace the open science framework, I registered here in the spirit of open access to data, to let the community know my plans for this work and to invite engagement and feedback. I also registered the review on the Prospero database of systematic reviews. So the full list of eligibility criteria can be found either on the website or in the published paper or the protocol, but the main criteria were that it had to be studies or articles that were highlighting problems with published systematic reviews. So studies which talked about potential problems with systematic reviews but didn't actually apply the problems to any examples in the literature were excluded, as were studies which looked at problems with systematic reviews or meta-analyses that didn't claim to have been conducted in the context of a systematic review. And that is because a meta-analysis is really just a statistical technique, and if it hasn't been done in the context of a systematic review and it hasn't been really clear and comprehensive about how it's arrived at its set of studies, it shouldn't really be trusted. So the literature searches for this review were not standard because problems with systematic review is a complex theoretical concept to develop. So we did some very complex literature searches with 3 information specialists. After we'd done the searches, we arrived at around 10,000 relevant records. Screening the titles, it looked like there was about 2,000 that we needed to really look at in full text in order to see if it was eligible. And after excluding around 1,500 records, we have ended up with 485 included articles which highlight problems in systematic reviews in this first iteration of the living review. So this graph here really shows the diversity and the number of studies that were included in the included articles. So some were literally an editorial highlighting maybe several problems with one systematic review. And that ranged right up to some people highlighting and researching problems with tens of thousands of systematic reviews and everything in between. So, in the first draft of this review, we found 67 problems, which are very difficult to squeeze onto one slide, and I would direct you to go and have a closer look on the website, which will show you not only the problems, a description of them, but also the included articles for each problem. But they generally revolve around these 4 themes that we expect from a systematic review. We expect it to be comprehensive, to identify as many problems, as many articles as possible. We expect it to have been done using rigorous or best practice methods, and we expect it to be done transparently so that it's reported in a way such that would enable anyone to replicate it and hopefully find the same conclusion. We also expect it to be done objectively by people who don't have a stake in the conclusions of the review, and this is an area that probably receives the least attention from guidelines. So here's an overall description of the 4 domains. And the other thing that we did is, for each article, we pulled out some relevant keywords for each article, really to highlight what the particular medical specialty the paper was looking at, whether there were systematic reviews of mental health or in emergency medicine, and also what were the particular areas of bias, error or problem, reproducibility, that kind of thing that they were highlighting. So this is just a word cloud which documents how frequently these issues came up. So it's not a particularly scientific way of looking at the prevalence of themes, but it's just a little snapshot as to what were the kind of things that were coming up. And as you can see, Cochrane and general medicine come up quite often, just because those are quite easy samples to pick on, to look at high impact journals or to look at the Cochrane database. So those are quite easy targets. So I also extracted from each paper where the first author from each paper was based. And as you can see from this chloropleth map, there are very few included articles coming out of Africa as a continent, and also some other areas of the world. And so whilst we see an underrepresentation from African natures, I don't necessarily see this as a fault in African research outputs. Rather, I see that methodological or research on research work is a privileged research area with historical underpinnings, and I'm able to observe this because I'm in the privileged position of having a fellowship award which allows me to do methodological research. For others, they're busy in the field doing the clinical research, but you do see more meta-epidemiological methodological work, such as these included studies, originating from research institutes and countries which have benefited from the availability of these privileged funding opportunities and streams. So another point is that the proliferation of global meta-research is not necessarily a good thing, because methodological brands of research are outpacing primary clinical research in many areas, and some countries are really good at gaming the system because these meta-research areas are quite cost-effective ways of getting a paper published. So you see a lot of teams doing very similar work where they'll just take a sample of systematic reviews and assess them against the PRISMA guidelines and then publish that as a paper. You see a lot of Me Too papers, people doing that with different journals, different specialities, and not really producing anything different to what anyone else is finding. So there is quite a lot of research waste that comes from meta-research, particularly when we don't build upon it and we don't try to move the conversation on and join it up and really look at it. So that really was the point of my work. Now, looking at solutions, what can we do really to improve systematic reviews going forward? We can apply those same 4 principles of systematic review conduct to this area. We want to be comprehensive in who we include in the systematic review teams. We want to ensure that we have someone who can perform searches, somebody with some skills in information resources. We want to make sure that the questions that we're asking are important, so public involvement in at least developing a systematic review question is advisable, but also having expertise from clinicians to make sure that we are using the best possible methods and outcomes for measuring that systematic review question. Having some search reflexivity, considering grey literature and sources that are not just published in academic journals are also ways to ensure that your review is comprehensive. There are guidance out there, not behind a paywall, to help any team to reach for the best practice methods in systematic review conduct. Also, we need to plan our systematic review before we start it and say what we're going to do before we start to do it. Not being surprised by heterogeneity and the fact that when you ask a broad question, you will get a broad mix of studies, and trying to engage statistical expertise in that process so we don't just rule out findings when they are heterogeneous, and look at ways that we can actually say something useful about what we've found. Transparency. So registering a review, documenting any deviations to the protocol at the protocol source, using reporting guidelines to help the readability of your review, and then publishing your review regardless of the findings to avoid this file drawer effect where uninteresting or non-significant results are not published. And finally, data sharing so that others can see your data sets and assess the transparency of your review and whether it is replicable. The final criteria is objective, and there's definitely a balance to strike between being too invested and caring too much about the conclusion because it informs what you're doing next, or you have some sort of vested interest in the conclusion. So we don't want that. Equally, we don't want teams of methodologists doing reviews or meta-epi studies, methodological studies, just to get a paper published. We need a team of people who actually care about the research question and finding something valid. You're not necessarily redundant from the review if you do have vested interests, but acknowledging all your potential interests and managing them is very key, because it may be that you have a lot to offer to the review, but you're not the best person to be the primary investigator for the review and to make those critical decisions about what studies are in and what studies are out. And also accountability. Very often in my line of work, teams of people do reviews and then they move on to something else with very little accountability about what they've done and whether they should revisit it, update it in the light of retracted studies, etc. So that is definitely an area that requires a bit more attention from people doing systematic reviews in the future. So I hope you've enjoyed this talk, and I'm interested to speak to anyone who is interested in doing some further work and collaborating in future projects, whether that's to build upon my research findings or to extend the global representation of this research more generally. Thank you very much.